What's up guys, Joey here at schoolofmotion.com. Welcome to day 6 of 30 days of After Effects. This is part 2 of the tutorial series where we take MIDI information and we bring it into After Effects and we use it to trigger animations. And I have to warn you guys that this is the geekiest tutorial I've ever made in my entire life. It's Expression City, all right? And we're really gonna get our hands dirty and we're all gonna just feel filthy at the end of it. But if you can hang with it, if you can just bear with me and let your brain absorb it, by the end of this, hopefully you'll have a pretty good understanding of how this thing is set up and have some really cool ideas about what you can do with it. I want to say thanks really quickly to the Department of Motion Design at the Ringling College of Art and Design for sponsoring 30 Days of After Effects and making this possible. They are big fans of experimenting with motion design techniques and trying to do things that you haven't seen before or you haven't seen done well before. And so in that spirit, I decided to tackle MIDI animation in After Effects. So let's dive in. Hold on to your butts. Here we go. All right, here we go. Down the rabbit hole. So we are in Logic, and this is the track that I recorded for the demo for this video. So I'll just play a little bit of it. You can see the MIDI information down here. Okay. And then I did find a drumless backing track for this song, which was pretty useful. One of the things I hope this tutorial does is I wanted to give you guys ideas and kind of create, this is kind of something that hasn't been done a whole lot, and it would be really sweet to see what some really, really creative, amazing designer person could do with this technique, programming MIDI that goes along with a cool song and then using that to trigger animations. I'm really excited that it's working and sort of. So anyway, so we've got the MIDI information here. And obviously this is a lot more complicated than what we had in the first example, okay? I mean, I recorded, the first third of the song. There's just a ton of data here. And on top of that, there's a whole lot of different instruments, right? There's hi-hats, kick, snare, there's different cymbals, there's toms, there's probably 8 or 10 different instruments actually being played in here. If we go to something like this, right, there's a little drum fill in there. Let's see what else we got. Sort of over here in the chorus. Hurry, boy, it's waiting there for you. All right, so if you want to be able to have each instrument sort of trigger a different thing, you kind of need access to that instrument independently, okay? By default, you're not really getting that out of your MIDI file. So let me show you what happens if I just select this MIDI and I say export selection as MIDI file. There I'm getting that error again. So let me first come down here and say delete MIDI events outside locators. All right, and then I'm going to make sure I don't have any drum hits happening too early. That all looks good. And now we'll export that MIDI file. All right, cool. And let me just make a new folder here. We'll call it Demo 2. And this is called Africa Raw. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the audio file, just the bounced audio. Okay, and then I'm going to grab that MIDI file that we just made. So let's grab Africa Raw MIDI file. Make sure I have something selected in here, and I'm just going to rename. So this is the actual MIDI file from the demo. So I'm just going to rename that old for a minute, and let's import this one we just made. Okay, it takes a little longer than in the last tutorial because there's a lot more going on. And if I hit U, you can see, wow, there's a ton of data in there. Now here is the problem. Let's look at channel 0 velocity, and let's go into the graph editor and let's kind of jump in there, okay? And you can see there's peaks and there's hard hits and then weaker hits, and let's play the audio and see how it syncs up. Okay, so listen to just the kick drum. The kick drum doesn't exactly line up with this, okay? It's like it lines up with some hits, but not other hits. And then listen to the snare drum. right? So it lines up with some hits, but not other ones. So what happens is, by default, all of these MIDI notes, they get placed kind of willy-nilly onto some channels, okay? And what you really want is you want the kick on its own channel, the snare on its own channel, the hi-hat on its own channel. You want all of these things separated out, and that way you'll be able to more easily kind of trigger, you know, a certain animation on the kick, a certain animation on the snare. With this, it's going to be a lot harder because you're going to kind of have to manually tell it which of these hits goes with which instrument, okay? If everything's happening on the piano, it doesn't really matter. But this is a drum set, and so you've got multiple instruments happening at the same time. So this MIDI information we brought in isn't going to be too useful. Let's delete it, and let's hop back into Logic. I'll show you how to fix this. Okay, so we are back in Logic, and let's take a look at the MIDI information one more time. So here are our drums. All right, now let me show you, each of these notes is placed into a MIDI channel. And the way you find out which channels, you can open up your event list. All right, so in Logic, you have this kind of manager window over here, and this has a few different modes, but in event mode, it's showing you every single MIDI event in your song. Each of these notes is considered a MIDI event, and if I select one of them, it will highlight that event over here in the list, and it will show me in this column which channel it's in, okay? So this note is in channel 3, okay? This snare hit is in channel 2, okay? This snare hit is in channel 1. Now that's obviously gonna screw us up, okay? And what we want is we want every instrument in its own channel, okay? This kick drum is in channel 3. This kick drum's in channel 2, right? And that snare hit's in channel 2. So that's why in After Effects, when we were looking at the data, it looked like, you know, the kick was lining up with some of those hits but not others, and then the snare would line up with some of those hits but not others. It's because the kick and the snare sometimes were in the same channel, sometimes were in different channels, and that's not very useful. So what we want to do is put every instrument in its own channel. If I select, for example, a hi-hat note, okay, it'll show me over here, all right, which key on the software keyboard is actually corresponding to that note. You know, I'm playing on a sort of a drum-shaped MIDI controller, but all it's doing is it's sending notes to the computer, and it's interpreting, you know, this note is a kick, right? And this note is a snare. So this is the note for hi-hat, and when I select it, it highlights every single hi-hat hit, and you can see that, you know, they kind of all look like they're on channel 1. So the hi-hats actually look like they might be set up right. But just to make sure, once you've highlighted everything, you can come over here and you can actually sort of batch adjust all of them, okay? And make sure they're all on the same channel. So now they are all on channel 1. That's great. So now we just have to do that for the rest of the instruments, all right? So I'm not gonna do all of them, but I'll do a couple more because there's a couple of things that kind of trip me up, and maybe I can save some people some hassle. So here's the kicks, right? I'll select all of them by clicking that little key, and I can look in the list and I see that you've got some are on channel 3, some are on channel 2, and you want them all on the same channel. So let's try to put them all on channel 2. And if I click over here, at first it doesn't let me change it at all. If I hold Shift, it does let me change it, okay? And I'm honestly not sure why, but just know if you're using Logic, it does. Now here's the problem. If I move it up like this, right? So now it's channel 8. This one's on channel 7. And the problem is it's incrementing them all the same, and I want to change them all so they're all on the same channel. So this is a trick I figured out. You select all the notes, you come over to your edit menu, your functions menu, and you want to say set MIDI channel to voice number. And what that will do is it will set every note to the same channel. Now if I hold Shift, I can move these up to channel 2. Okay? So now I've got hi-hats all on channel 1, kick all on channel 2. Let's set the snare, okay? And you can see some are on channel 2, some are on channel 1, and I want them all to go to channel 3. So I'm gonna do the same thing. Set MIDI channel to voice number, so it sets all of them to the same channel, and then hold Shift and move this up to channel 3. There we go, cool. You just do that for every instrument that's in here, okay? And it doesn't even take that long. Here's my cowbell. right? And even the cowbell, this makes no sense to me. Some are on 3, some are on 2. So yes, you just do the same thing. Set MIDI channel to voice number, and then hold shift and move that up to 4. There you go. All right, so once that's done, then you can export that MIDI, and when it comes into After Effects, it's gonna be much more useful. So let's hop back in there. All right, so let's import that MIDI. And I had already imported this previously. All right, so let me make sure that I've got my, something in this sequence selected, hit apply, and it's gonna take a little while, but this time you're gonna see a whole lot more channels come through, okay? What's strange to me is that it seems as though the channels that you assign things to in Logic don't always match what comes through here, but that's not such a big deal, right? Because what you can do is, let's hit U, and you can see a whole bunch of keyframes here, but they're a lot more spread out because we've separated instruments onto their own channels. If I just hit audio preview here, right? Watch this column right here. Obviously that's the kick drum. Channel 11 is the kick drum, okay? So it's easy to figure out. You wanna figure out hi-hat. It looks to me like this is the hi-hat up here. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. All right, so it's a lot easier to figure out when they're separated into their own channels like that. So first thing I'm gonna do is clean this up a little bit. And what I decided to do, as opposed to trying to work with the velocities of these, right? I mean, there is some change in the velocity. This is the hi-hat track, remember? And so, I've kind of got varying, hardness of my hi-hat hits here. But I wanted to just actually make this simpler. And every time I hit a drum or a hi-hat or a cymbal, I want it to trigger something. So that's what we're gonna do. And to do that, all we need is this duration property here, okay? You can see there's one keyframe for each hit, and I simplified the playing so that I could make sure that all of my hits kind of end up triggering and registering. So we have a keyframe for every single drum hit. And all I'm gonna need are these duration rows. I don't need the velocity, I don't need the pitch. So I'm just gonna quickly go through and I'm gonna delete everything. Let me just do select all here. And all I wanna keep are the durations, okay? So I'm just gonna deselect, I'm holding command, I'm just gonna deselect all of the durations here for all of the channels. And then I'm gonna delete everything else, okay? So now we literally just have keyframes where every single hit is, and this is gonna be a lot easier to deal with, okay? And if you zoom out, this isn't even the whole song. The song is actually, the part I recorded is like 1.5 minutes long, but let's just deal with this part, okay? Cool. So here's where it gets crazy, frankly. And I want to just level with you guys that this is some pretty dense expression stuff here, and I'm gonna walk you through it as best I can. What I suggest is if you really want to understand this, don't just watch this tutorial, actually apply it. I'll have the expressions that you can copy and paste right off of this tutorials page. And I'm gonna walk you through them, but until you actually get in there and you type these things in, and I want you to type in the code yourself, because your brain needs to sort of internalize it, wrap itself around, okay? So how do we trigger something with a keyframe, all right? This is just a kind of a fundamental problem with After Effects, is how can I make an animation and then have it triggered really simply based on keyframes? So the main idea behind this actually comes from Dan Ebert's page Motion Script. If you get on there, he has a great tutorial. Now the way he does it is he basically uses layer markers, right? These little guys, to trigger animations. It's the exact same principle though, okay? You're using an expression to figure out based on the current time, all right? So let me close this down and we'll just focus on, let's not use the hi-hat. Let's figure out which one is the kick. This is the kick right here. Okay, channel 1. Actually, this is the snare, but good enough. We'll use the snare. Okay. If we want something to happen every time, boom, we hit one of these keyframes, we need to know the current time of our comp, right? And we need to know where the closest keyframe is to the current time, okay? And basically we're doing a little bit of checking on each frame. We're saying, hey, am I on a keyframe? Am I on a keyframe? Am I on a keyframe? Am I on a key? Hey, I'm on a keyframe. On that frame that we're on a keyframe, we're gonna set the value of something to its initial value. All right, and then I'm not on a keyframe anymore. I'm still not on a keyframe. I'm still not on a keyframe. Every time it's not on a keyframe, it's gonna figure out what should my current value be based on where the last keyframe was, okay? So for example, if I wanted, here, we'll just use a circle. We'll start simple. Oh boy, people, here we go. Here we go. All right, so let's say here's a circle, right? On every snare hit, I want it to jump, like grow really fast and then slowly shrink down. Okay, so let's just animate that real quick. So you have to start your animations with kind of the idle pose, okay? So this is the idle pose. It's just sitting there. Put a keyframe there. As soon as it gets triggered, right, I want it to be much bigger. And then over 12 frames, I want it to end up back at its initial value. And let's just ease that, okay? All right, so that's what a snare hit's gonna look like, boom. Okay? And I want that animation to be triggered every single time we see a snare hit, okay? So here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna write an expression to trigger this animation every time we hit the snare. Now, the easiest way to do this is to sort of create your animation like this, right? And then pre-comp the whole thing. All right, and we'll just call this snare circle. Now, why are we pre-comping it? Well, here's why. What we're gonna be doing is we're gonna have to sort of manually be controlling some property, right? And if it was scale, that wouldn't be that hard if we only had a couple of keyframes, but we have 3 keyframes here. And it's gonna just get a lot more complicated if we try to, have to decide should the circle be at this value, or this value. It's trickier with more than 2 values. So the great thing is once you've pre-comped something, you can just time remap it. So I'm gonna enable time remapping. And I'm gonna go forward and figure out like, okay, how much of this animation do I need? I really only need half a second, right? Let's see, this is a 24 frames per second comp. The thing is done by frame 13. All right, so let's just call it a second. All we want is for the first second of this animation to be triggered every time there's a snare hit. Okay. So we basically need to write an expression for this that's gonna figure out, what frame should we be showing of this animation based on, where these keyframes are. All right, so let's jump right in. So first we need to know the beginning and ending value of that time remap that we want to sort of interpolate between, okay? So why don't we say start value equals 0, because we're going to start at the first frame, which is frame 0, and then the end value is going to be 1. All right, now why is it 1? Why isn't it 24 frames? Well, even though this time remap property is showing you frames, internally it's working in seconds. It's just one of those confusing gotchas that you need to know. When you're writing expressions on things that need a time, you're gonna actually work in seconds, not frames. And if you want to work in frames, you need to convert and maybe divide the result by 24 or 30 based on the frame rate. All right, so now we know that. We also need to know what the current comp time is. So wherever our playhead is, we need to know where that is. We don't need to do anything because After Effects has a built-in variable called time. And so all you do is type in time and it will return whatever the current time is. But we do need to know where the nearest keyframe is. After Effects has a function built in that will let you figure out where the closest keyframe is to anything, okay? So the way it works is this. I first need to tell After Effects which property I'm looking at to figure out where the closest keyframe is. That property, in this case, is this slider. So I'm gonna make a variable So our reference property equals, and then I'm just gonna pick whip that slider. Cool. Next, I want to figure out where the closest keyframe is, okay? And so what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna make a variable, I'm gonna call it n, right, for nearest. And this is how it works. To find the nearest keyframe, you first type in the name of the property that you want to find the nearest keyframe for. Then you add a period, and you're gonna add the function nearest key. In parentheses, you then have to give After Effects a time. And the reason you can do that is because what if I wanted to know where the nearest keyframe is to the beginning of my layer, right? And not necessarily the nearest keyframe to my playhead, but the nearest keyframe to something else. So because I want the nearest keyframe to my playhead, I'm just gonna type in time and close that off, okay? Now this doesn't do anything yet, but I wanna stop for a minute to show you a little trick I use sometimes when I'm doing expressions to help me figure stuff out. I'm just gonna make a type layer here. And I'm gonna come up here, I'm gonna open up the type layer and reveal the source text property. Source text lets you actually change what the type layer says, and you can put expressions on that. So if I copy this expression and I hold Option, click the stopwatch and paste it in there. There we go. What I wanna do is I actually want this type layer to show me the current time, or sorry, not the current time. I want it to show me the time of the closest keyframe, like where in time is the closest keyframe. So I've got this variable here, n, right? And n, you might think what it's actually gonna return, like with the value of n, is going to be a time, but it's not. What it's actually going to be is, and this may be weird if you have no programming experience, but n actually becomes a keyframe, okay? This nearest key function, it doesn't give you the time of the nearest keyframe, it gives you a keyframe. Once you have the keyframe, you can ask the keyframe, hey, what time are you at, right? Or what index number do you have, right? And the way you do that, you take the variable n and you put a dot, and then you can ask it a question. My question to you, n, is what time are you at, okay? And so now this type layer is going to show me the value of the nearest keyframe. Or sorry, not the value, the time of the nearest keyframe. So the nearest keyframe, you can see this hasn't changed because if I'm at the beginning, this is the nearest keyframe. If I'm here, it's the nearest keyframe. And as I go forward, it changes right there because now the nearest keyframe is here. And this is where we run into a little bit of a curveball. The value of the nearest keyframe is going to change when we get to the middle. There's not like a simple way to just say, okay, I want to know where the next keyframe is, right? It only can give you the nearest one. Another thing you can ask the keyframe is what index are you, right? And the index is literally what number are you? You're the first keyframe. You're the second, third, fourth, fifth, right? So that's going to be very useful too. All right, so let's just keep that up. It's just kind of nice to know, like when you're writing expressions and sometimes you're having trouble figuring out what they're doing, you can just make a type layer and just use it almost like a little debugging thing. So let's lock that. All right, so let's hop back into our time remap expression. So n is actually the keyframe. What I actually want n to be, though, is the index of the nearest keyframe, and you'll see why in a minute, okay? So what we need to do is, so let me try to talk you through this. This is gonna be very hard to explain, but what I want this expression to do is check to see, hey, are we on a keyframe? If we're on a keyframe, I want time remap to be 0. And then as we get further and further away from the keyframe, I want the time remap to increase, right? To play the animation that we've created in this pre-comp. And so if we're 1 second in front of this keyframe, I want that animation to stop. And then we'll just wait until the next keyframe. Boom, here's another keyframe. Go back to 0. And then as we get further and further away, play and play, play. Up, another keyframe. So what we need to know in order to make that happen is we need to know what the difference is between the current time and the time of the last keyframe. Okay? So if the last keyframe, was a second ago, right? Then I know that a second has passed. So this time remap should be 1 second, right? If it's a half second, this time remap should be 1 second. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract the current time, I'm going to subtract the time of the last keyframe from the current time. And that'll basically give me the value of the time remap, okay? But then we have a wrinkle here because the only variable I have so far is the index of the nearest keyframe, not the previous keyframe. So in order to make sure we're always looking at the previous keyframe, we need to check to see where we are in time. And think of it this way: if the current time, right, is greater than the time of the nearest keyframe, then that means we are in front of the keyframe that we're focusing on, right? Once we get to here, well, now that the time of the nearest keyframe is actually greater than the current time. And in that case, we want to look back 1 keyframe and make sure we're still focused on the right one. So that's why this variable n is now the index of the keyframe, because what that's going to let me do is make a little condition, okay? If this playhead is on or in front of the nearest keyframe, then I want to find out, okay, look, right now the nearest keyframe's index is 1, and we know that our time is in front of this, okay? Then what I need to make sure is that I'm asking the keyframe with the index of 1, what time are you at? But as soon as we get closer to this keyframe, well, now my index is switching. And so now the condition is, the condition's being met that now the time of the keyframe with index 2 is actually later than the current time. Well, in that case, I don't care about keyframe index 2. I still want keyframe index 1. So here's what we're going to do. This n is the index of the nearest keyframe. And what I'm going to do is type in an if statement, okay? And this is how it works. If parentheses, and then in parentheses, what condition are we checking? Is the current time, and I want to know, is it greater than or equal to the nearest keyframe time? Okay? So, is it greater than or equal to, and this is how you type that in, greater than or equal to, that's what that means, the time of the nearest keyframe, okay? And so what I'm gonna do, actually, let me quickly come up here and copy this and paste it. And I'm just gonna make another variable called n time to make this easier to check, okay? And all I'm doing is, instead of getting the index, I'm getting the time of the nearest keyframe, okay? So if the time is greater than or equal to n time, right, then what needs to happen? Well, in that case, actually, you know what? I'm doing this backwards. I screwed up, but I'm going to let you see it. I'm going to let you see me squirm. Here's what we're going to do. We are going to check if the time is less than or equal to the nearest keyframe time. Now, why are we doing that, okay? Okay, here's why. If the time is equal to or greater than one of these keyframes, then we don't have to worry about it, okay? Because all we need to do is ask the nearest keyframe, hey, what time are you at? And then subtract that time from the current time, and we'll get our answer. The problem happens when the current time is less than the nearest keyframe. And when that happens, we do need to deal with it. We do need something to happen. So that's why I'm going to deal with that condition first. If that's the condition, the current time is less than or equal to the nearest keyframe's time. If that is the case, you notice I just tabbed over. You don't have to do that. It just makes your code a little bit easier to read. But if that happens, then I want to make sure that I am no longer looking at the keyframe with index of 2. I want to look at the keyframe with index of 1. So what I want to do is basically take this variable n, right, which is the index of the nearest keyframe, and I want to subtract 1 from it. So there's you could just say n equals n minus 1. There's a shorter way to do it. The shortcut is just n minus minus. that just increments n by 1. And you can also do n plus plus, right? But n minus minus, and then go to the next line, and I close the little curly brackets, okay? So what that has done is we have a variable n. N is the index of the nearest keyframe, 1 or 2. In this case, it's 2. But because the time of keyframe 2 is actually ahead of our playhead, we're gonna increment n down by 1. So now we're looking at this keyframe again. What this ensures is that we are always looking at the keyframe behind us. Okay, cool. So now that we've done that, what we need to do is figure out what is the difference in time between our current time and this keyframe's time. So what we need to do is now figure out the exact time of this keyframe, okay? So if we are here or we are here, what we want to use is this n variable, okay? So what I'm going to do is, let's just put the playhead here, and let's say that the near key time equals n, okay? Sorry, that's not what we want to do. N is the index of this keyframe. It is not actually the keyframe. So what we're going to do is we have to type a slightly different expression here. We are going to start with this ref property variable. So remember that ref property is referring to this slider here. Then we're going to put a period, and we're going to use the term key. What this allows us to do is actually access all of the keyframes on that layer. And if you type in key and then in parentheses put a number like that, it will actually refer to the first keyframe, right? Or the second keyframe. If we put a variable in there, n, it's referring to the nth keyframe, right? Whatever this number is, right? Whatever the value of n is, that's the keyframe it's looking at. So because we have this little if in there, it's always going to be referring to the keyframe just behind the playhead. Okay? And now that we've figured out what keyframe we want, we can also ask that keyframe, so dot time. Hey, so let me try to put this in English for you. We are saying the near key time variable equals this property right here, and then we're asking that property, hey, I want to know about the keyframe with the index n. N right now is 1, so I'm asking about this keyframe, and then we're asking that keyframe, hey, what time are you at? And that's the result. That's what this variable is gonna get, okay? And so then what we want to do is we want to, why don't we just say D? D is, I always use D when I'm like doing subtraction, because D is for delta, or like delta is another word for change, right? So the change, D, is the current time minus the near key time. Cool. So if we are here at 1 second, the time is 1, and the keyframe here is at, you know, a little after half a second. Okay, so it's like 0.6. So D is going to equal 0.4. If the playhead was right on this keyframe, D would equal 0. Okay, because if we're sitting here at 0.6 seconds, and this is at 0.6 seconds, this keyframe, then it's 0. And as we get further away, that value will increase. So we have an increasing value, and we want to interpolate that value between 0 and 1 seconds to play this animation. Okay? Hopefully it's starting to click. I know this is pretty wacky. So I'm going to use the linear expression like we did in part 1 of this tutorial. So I'm going to say linear. We are looking at the variable D. We know it's going to go between 0 and we actually don't know you know, what value it's like, what the maximum value of it's going to be, but it really doesn't matter. The way the linear expression works is if I give this a value of 0 and 1, and at some point the value of D ends up being 2, right, greater than this range, what it does is it caps it, right? So this kind of clamps your values. So since my start value is 0 and my end value is 1, I want to make sure that I'm looking for 0 and 1, all right? And an easier way to do this would just be, just use those variables, the start value and the end value, okay? So we're looking at variable D, looking for numbers between 0 and 1, and then we just want to return values between 0 and 1. So in this case, this is actually kind of a unique case for this linear expression. You know, we're using the same two variables here, and actually I got to make sure these are case sensitive, so make sure that you use the same case when you do this. You know, we're basically interpolating values of this variable from 0 to 1 to 0 to 1. So that's why these are the same, okay? It won't always be like that, but for using, you know, for using linear to trigger animations, a lot of times you are using the same variables. All right, so let's see what happens, all right? Let's see if this thing actually works, okay? So let's turn on our layer here. All right, now, here is the problem. Okay, we're getting an error, and this is where I had to look this up for help because I wouldn't have known how to do this either. So there's a problem. The first problem is if we open up, I keep closing this, which I shouldn't. I should just leave it open. But if you look at this, you're gonna have a problem at the beginning of the animation, right? Because there is no keyframe back here, and the nearest keyframe is in front of us, which means that we're actually gonna take this n variable and subtract 1 from it. The problem is this is the first keyframe, so if we do that, we're gonna have a problem. So what you can do is you can have another if statement saying, hey, if the nearest keyframe to me is in front of me and it's the first keyframe, then don't do anything yet, okay? So why don't we try that? Let me just try that and see if that does it, but I believe I'm still gonna have a problem. So here's what we need to do. Okay, we're gonna change this if-then statement just a little bit. If the current time is less than or equal to the time of the next keyframe, well, that's the case right now. The next thing we need to do is add one more if. Okay, so if that's the case, we'll then also check for this: is n greater than 1. Okay. Now, the reason we're asking if n is greater than 1 is because there's this one case at the beginning of the animation where the nearest keyframe is in front of us, and normally what we want to do is make sure that we subtract 1 from n so that we're looking at the previous keyframe. Well, in this one case, at the beginning, there is no keyframe, so we don't want to do anything yet, okay? So if n is greater than 1, right, if we're already, if we're looking past this, cool, right? But if not, don't do anything, okay? And let's see here. So let's see, hey, look at that. All right, so let's do a RAM preview. Let's see what we got here. Well, holy bejeez, look at that. We have a working expression now. It's interesting. This is actually slightly different than the expression that I used to actually make the demo. If we look at that expression, let's see here. I've actually had to include some other stuff because I was getting errors, and there's actually ways in After Effects expressions to check, is there an error? And if there's an error, do this, and if not, do this. But it looks like right now everything's working, so I'm not going to look the gift horse in the mouth. All right, so hopefully you understand what's happening, okay? We're doing, you know, we're kind of doing a couple things. We're checking to see where the nearest keyframe is. If it's in front of us, look back one keyframe. So let's figure out how far we are from the previous keyframe, and let's use a linear expression to trigger this animation. Now this is great, right? And you know, for a kick drum or something like that, or something that's just kind of repeating, and you're not playing too many notes too close together, this is great, okay? But let's go to here, this part where we have 4 snare hits in a row, okay? Okay, you see how it gets a little funky in there? It gets a little funky in there, okay? And the reason it's getting funky is because these are so close together, and the animation starts to play, boom, but then it has to then start over again. And it would be really nice if you could sort of have overlapping animations and not just have something that, you know, just basically it starts playing at the first frame and it plays until it hits another keyframe and then it jumps back to the first frame. You want it to be a little smoother and maybe have some overlapping notes and stuff. And just to show you though how cool this is, so that's the snare circle, right? If I, let me scale this down a little bit, and then let's duplicate it. And let's make this the kick circle, okay? Make this 100%. And then let's just fill this with a different color, right? So one will be, let's make it a little darker. So one is gonna be the kick, one is gonna be the snare. And actually, this is a good time to talk about sort of some of the other things I did with these expressions to make this a little bit easier to deal with, right? Because what I want to do now is I want to use this exact same expression, except I want to reference a different property, okay? And, you know, if I have 8 instruments or 10 instruments and I want to keep coming in here and, you know, changing this every single time, it gets a little bit annoying. And it also could be a problem if I, you know, decided to tweak the MIDI a little bit and re-export a new one. And I just want to like just bring in a new MIDI file, but have all this stuff line right up to it. So what I did was I did a couple of things, right? So actually, let me turn this off for a minute. Let me actually delete this. And we're going to do a quick tweak to this snare expression. I'm going to add a new null. And I'm gonna call this song control. And I'm just gonna use this null to tell every single layer in my comp that needs to know which layer has the MIDI information, okay? And so I'm gonna use an expression control called layer control. And this is gonna be renamed to MIDI layer. And this expression control, it lets you pick any layer in your comp, and then other layers can pick whip to that, right? So my MIDI layer is layer 4 MIDI, okay? So the first thing I can do is open up my expressions here, and I can change the first part of this, reference property equals, and instead of doing this, right, this comp, the layer called MIDI, I can pick whip. If I open this up, I can pick whip to this, okay? So now it's saying this comp, the layer song control, the effect MIDI layer, okay? And what that's actually doing is it's gonna pick the layer, it's gonna pick, you know, your After Effects layer from this, okay? So that didn't mess anything up, okay? It didn't change anything, but now if I ever needed to, I could pick a different MIDI and this would automatically update, okay? The next thing I wanna make easier on myself is I know that you know, each of the instruments is on a different channel, okay? And I want to easily be able to pick channel 0, channel 8, channel 11, channel 10. I want to make this easy on myself. So on the actual snare circle layer, I'm going to add an expression control that's a slider control, and I'm going to call that channel, okay? And what I'm gonna do here, so first off, let's see. So we are currently using channel 1, okay? So let me make sure that this is set to channel 1. And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna make a new variable in this expression and I'm just gonna call it channel. And I'm gonna set it to this, okay? And what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna change this part of the expression a little bit, okay? So right now, the reference property variable is being set to whatever layer is being picked here, and then on that layer, it's looking for an effect called channel 1 duration. And I don't want it to always look for that. I want it to look for channel whatever this is set to duration, okay? So what I'm gonna do is I'm actually gonna close my quotes here, right? And I'm gonna close my quotes here. I'm gonna delete this 1 that's hard-coded in there, okay? And so what I'm gonna do, you see how I've separated these two parts of the string, ch underscore and underscore dur, and what you can do is you can just add another part to this string and it'll sort of create the new type for you, right? So ch underscore, and then I'm going to add whatever number that is. All right, so that number is whatever this channel variable is. And then I'm going to add the last part of that and hit enter. And we are getting an error. And what it's, let's see, error at line 4. Okay, so something here with the syntax isn't working. I think what it might be is I need to make sure that this variable right now, you know, it's giving me a number, but I need to make sure that it's actually giving me the value of that number and not like a, you know, some representation of that number. So I'm actually just going to add a dot value to the end of the channel. All right, so that fixed it. So channel equals that slider dot value, and then that variable basically just gets plugged in there. And what's cool is if I duplicate this now, so that's my snare circle. So now let's make my kick circle. All right, and let's generate a fill and make it, you know, some kind of color, and let's scale it back up to 100. Okay, so now what we have 2 layers reacting to the snare, but I want this one to react to the kick. So let's figure out what channel the kick's on. Go into MIDI, and let's just play it. All right, so it's this. It's channel 11. Okay, so now if I just go here and I type in 11, awesome. Isn't that cool? And now you could really easily, you know, if you wanted to do the hi-hat, you know, just like maybe scoot it over here. Let's figure out what channel is the hi-hat. It's this one, channel 0. So if you just set this to channel 0, right? Right, and make this one much smaller. Let's make this 20%. Greatness. Okay, so now let's talk about another way that you can use this MIDI information. Okay, because this is cool, and sometimes this is what you want, but sometimes you want things that can overlap. And the best way to do that is with particles. Okay, so let's do this. Let's turn all this stuff off, and let's here. Let me find out where is this pre-comp. It's here, right here, snare circle. Let's duplicate this, and let's call this snare particle. And if this was gonna be a particle, then what I would want is for eventually that to disappear, okay? So why don't we say, let's do it this way, okay? Let's have it start at scale 0, and then really quickly grow fast, okay? And then fade back over maybe a second. Fade back to 0. All right, so that's the particle that I want to be spawned every time there's a snare hit, okay? And what I'm gonna do, I'm gonna trim the comp like this. When you're making a particle for you know, any particle effect to use, you want to crop your comp so that it's only as big as it needs to be. So I'm gonna click my region of interest button, and I'm just gonna try and crop this so it's only as big as it has to be. Cool, and then you go composition, crop, comp to region of interest. There you go. So there's our particle. Boom. Okay. And it's actually, this is probably much bigger than we need it to be too. So why don't we actually shrink this down a little bit? I'm just gonna shrink it maybe 400. All right, and then I can just grab all these keyframes and scale them down a little bit. Make sure this starts at 0 and ends at 0. Cool, so there's our particle. I'm gonna bring this in here and I'm gonna hide it. I'm gonna make a new solid, and I'm gonna put particular on it, which is one of the best plugins out there. All right, so particular, look at that. So particular, this is kind of the default thing it does. And so what I'm going to do is first tell it to emit this as its particle. So let's come here. We'll go to the particle settings and particular I could do 10 tutorials on. There's a ton of settings, and I'm just going to show you the ones you need to get this effect to work. So the particle, I'm going to change that to a sprite. All right, and sprite just means it's going to let you use another layer as its particle. Then I'm going to go into texture, and I'm going to say the layer I want you to use is this snare particle layer. Okay, and time sampling, I want it to start at birth and play once. And what that means is when the particle is born, I want it to play this animation one time, and then the particle is dead, and that's it. Okay. You could, there's other cases where maybe you want it to loop the animation over and over again, but not in this case. All right, so then I'm going to come up here and let me name this layer. Let's say new snare particle. Okay, I'm just realizing that I actually made all those changes on this particle, which is not what I wanted to do. So let me fix that real quick. So this is going to be a sprite, and the texture is going to be snare particle. Okay, and then I need to make the size bigger so I can actually see. Okay, so cool. So you can see what's happening. Boom, right? It makes those particles. And then that's it, right? It's pretty cool. And what I want is to, let me turn this off too, because we don't need that anymore. What I want to happen is I want these particles to be born every single time there's a keyframe. One thing I need to change real quick, the time sampling on here is supposed to be start at birth, play once. There we go, okay. So what it's doing right now is it's generating these particles constantly, okay, because that's what the plugin does. And so what I want to do is I basically want to have a burst of particles. And the way you have a burst is you change the emitter settings. So the particles per second right now is 100. And so what I can do is I can put a keyframe here, right? Make that a hold keyframe, and then go forward one frame and make this 0, okay? And so what that will do is it will just make a bunch of particles and then stop. And then if I want, I can do the same thing. Go to 0 now, okay? So it makes particles, it stops, and then it makes more particles and it stops. Now you see the flickering that's happening there? This is one of the annoying things about particular. It kind of has a bug. It's a known thing where if you're changing values, sometimes it doesn't delete the old frames it rendered and it keeps showing you old frames. An easy trick is you just go into the random seed here and you change it, right? So now we'll kind of force it to re-render. Right, so there's one burst and there's another burst. Cool? So if we can get this particles per second to basically flip on for a frame and then flip off, we can create bursts of particles, right? So what I'm gonna do, let me grab the expression that we wrote for here's our kick and our snare, okay? So let's grab it from this, copy it, and let's bring it in here, okay? So I'm gonna put an expression on particles per second. I'm gonna paste that in there. And here's what we're gonna change. Instead of the result that we're sort of returning being, this linear property here, what we need to do is we actually need to see, okay, if our playhead is on a keyframe, then I want a burst of particles. If we are not on a keyframe, I want no particles. So the behavior is a little bit different. We're not interpolating between values. We're saying I want to be on for a frame and then off, on for a frame, then off, okay? So really all we need to check is, are we touching a keyframe? So we actually don't need to mess with all of this stuff. All we need to know is, where's the nearest keyframe? Are we touching it? That's it, okay? So near key time, we're still concerned with that. We're still concerned with the difference between the current time and the near key time. But what we actually really want to know is, sometimes if I'm having trouble kind of articulating to myself what I need to do, I'll just sort of walk through it and kind of talk myself through it. So think about it. Where's the nearest keyframe? It's here. Okay, are we touching it? No. So we get here. Okay, we're touching it. Now, okay, so here's the tricky thing, right? The nearest keyframe is going to be sometimes... All right, look right there. The playhead is here. The keyframe is slightly in front of it. The playhead's here. The keyframe is slightly behind it. The problem with MIDI information is sometimes things do not come in on an exact frame. Okay? So what I actually need to do is check to see if we're very close to the keyframe. So if I just try to do something like this, right? Let me come up here. Oh boy. Here we go. If I tried to do something like this, right? If time equals, and if you're checking if something's equal in After Effects, you have to have two equal signs, something to keep in mind. If time equals near key time, then I want the value of the particles per second to be 100. Otherwise, that's what else, this is how the else thing works. I close one set of curly cues, I say else, I open up another set, and then I can say 0, okay? Effects, oh, right, and I forgot. So the error it just gave me is it's looking for an expression slider called channel on this layer, which doesn't exist. So what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna copy this channel slider, paste it on here. So now that should work, okay? All right, cool. So we are getting some particles. So let's listen to this and see what happens. All right, that's not really working that well, is it? Right? And we're getting like some random stuff here, and it's just not happening for us. And the reason is, right, because if we look here, we're never actually hitting that keyframe. We're getting really close, but we're never actually hitting it. And so what we need to do is actually check if the difference between the current time and the nearest key time is less than the duration of one frame. Okay? So here's the problem with that. Sometimes D is going to be positive and sometimes it's going to be negative. So if you think back to, you know, algebra or I don't remember when you learn this stuff now, but the concept of absolute value, right? So if something is -1 or if something is 1, the absolute value of both of those numbers is 1. So that's what you need. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to check if the absolute value of D, right? So the way you get the absolute value of D is you use a function called math. So if, and then in parentheses, math, and then math has a bunch of things it can do. And one of them is get the absolute value. If you can't remember this stuff, you can always click on this arrow and look through all of these little groups, right? And here's JavaScript math. And you can see there's absolute value, but you can also find out the square root and the cosine and all this kind of stuff. This is a great little reference for expressions. But if math absolute value of D is less than, okay, so basically whether D is positive or negative, we're going to make it positive, okay? And we're going to see if the difference between the current time and the nearest key time is less than 1 frame. And 1 frame is 1 second divided by 24 frames. Okay? So, if that's the case, what do? That means we are very close to a keyframe. So I want the value to be 100. Okay? Otherwise, I want the value to be 0. There you go. Okay? Now let's try and preview this. All right, you see all that flickering? That is that awesome problem that Particular has where we need to change the random seed. Get rid of our old frames. And there it is, beautiful. Bursts of particles created by MIDI notes, all right? And so what I wanted to do was actually not have it create a whole bunch of particles, but just create one particle. And so to do that, I kind of had to mess around. Right now what it's doing is every time it hits a snare, it's, for one frame, it's turning the particles per second to 100, and that's too high. Now if I turn it to 1, the problem is one particle, and of course now we have to change the random seed again, so it will, right? A value of 1 particle per second, it can work. The problem is sometimes it doesn't trigger, right? It triggers there, but then it misses 1. So 1 isn't enough, and I kind of played with the values, and 8 seemed to work pretty well. And of course, we need to change the random seed, so it resets. There we go. Cool. And these particles are moving, and if I don't want them to move, I'll just set the velocity to 0 and the velocity random to 0. And then let me just turn the size of these particles up too. Right? And there you go. Okay? And now we have our snare particle, and it's, you know, it's pretty close to the animation that we had before, except now they can overlap. All right? Let's do the same thing with a kick. Now that we've got this set up, it should be pretty easy. So let's just duplicate this. Call this new kick particle. And all I need to do, all right, so the kick is on channel 11. So let me just set this to 11. And then let's put, let's generate a fill effect for that and make it, you know, let's make it green this time. All right, and let's kind of scrub through. So there's my kick. And for this, we can make this one a little bit bigger. Or actually, maybe what we'll do is we'll make the snare particles a little smaller. All right, and we'll do, let's go particle size a little smaller. So there's some differentiation between the kick and the snare. Let's see what that looks like. So it appears to be working. Now, you know, I know that right now this whole process must seem really finicky and what a pain in the butt. And here's the thing, right? You know, eventually I'm sure someone is going to, you know, create a script or a plugin or something that makes this much easier. You know, MIDI is far from the cutting edge, but using MIDI with After Effects, it hasn't really taken off. It hasn't been that popular, and that's why it was not easy to find information about how to even try to do it. And, you know, unfortunately right now it's just sort of this clunky process. I guarantee you, if enough people start doing this, someone out there with a gigantic brain is going to make this much easier. But I'm actually pretty happy with the way this is working, and what I really hope is that it's, you know, we've really gotten into some deep expressions here, but it's also just kind of interesting to look at After Effects as this tool that you can plug in with other tools and do other neat little things with. You know, let's do one more little experiment here, right? So, I mean, the beauty of this is now we've kind of got two ways of triggering animations, right? Like we've got, we have our hi-hat over here, which is just an animation, right? That's being triggered. And why don't we make it a little bit more interesting too? Why don't we sort of, you know, why don't we make another little ellipse here, but kind of make it do something like this, right? And it can start like this and rotate. Can just sort of like jump 90 degrees and then rotate back to 0, right? And you know, just you could just play with it and just see what you can come up with. But this technique here, right, of time remapping a layer based on the MIDI information, that works great for stuff that you want to be a little bit more complex in the way it moves. But you can trigger simple things with particles. right? So that's the hi-hat, and you can see it feels jerky because of how quick those hi-hat hits are coming. But you can, you can use particles to trigger kind of simpler things. And then, the last thing I'll show you guys is you can just use particular sort of as a particle system and not even as a way to trigger animations. We know that channel 11 is, channel 11 is the kick, okay? And we know that channel 8 is the cowbell, right? Because it's just a constant coordinate pulse. So what that means is channel 10 must be that cymbal. So why don't we have that cymbal trigger a big burst of particles, okay? So I'm gonna duplicate this, and I'm gonna call this new cymbal 01 particle. I'm gonna change the channel to channel, I believe it was 10. I've already forgotten. This has been a long tutorial. Let's just double check. Yep, channel 10 is that cymbal. And I'm gonna just change the settings on this, okay? So instead of having the particles be a sprite, I'm just gonna have them be spheres. And they can be much smaller, right? Maybe 5 or something like that. And so when I play this, and I know I'm just gonna do it preemptively, I'm gonna have to change the random seed so it sort of forces a re-render there. Okay. Now we're not seeing anything. Oh, there's 0 velocity. So let's put some velocity on those particles so we can actually get some movement. All right, so you see there's 1 particle floating away there. If you actually want particles, like a big kind of fireworks looking thing, then going to 100 particles, 8 particles per second isn't gonna do it. We need that number to be much higher. And I knew this, and being that I don't like to have to keep diving in and diving into the code and finding where that number is. Okay, it's hidden down here, 8. What I'd rather do is give myself a slider control and say, okay, these little bursts of particles, how many particles should there be? And I'm just going to use that slider to drive this value. So instead of 8, it's going to use whatever I have this set to. So if I set this to 100, right? And then, of course, particular. To make this easier on myself, I'm actually going to duplicate the slider, and I'm going to call this random seed. And I am going to make a quick expression linking the random seed to, let me see if I can actually get to it way down here, this slider. There we go. So now I can just change the random seed just by messing with that. That's a lot quicker, right? And so now if we look at this, right, and you'll see it'll start taking a little longer preview. Okay, still not enough. Let's up that. Let's make that burst amount 2,000. There we go. Greatness. That's better, okay? And these particles are kind of boring right now. I mean, it works, but it's kind of boring, and so let me solo these for a minute. What I did in the demo was I really cranked up the velocity, like really, really high. So they really like explode when they come out. But then, at the same time, I went into the physics tab, into the air tab, and I turned up the air resistance a little bit, right? So what it does is it makes them shoot out really fast, but then they slow down, right? And right about there, I'd like them to dissolve. So I'm also going to go into the particle settings here, and I'm going to set the life to just 1 second. Give that a little bit of randomness, but then I'm going to go to opacity over life. And I'm just gonna have it kind of fade out over the lifespan, okay? So now that burst is gonna look like this. Cool. All right, and so there you go. Here, let's duplicate that hi-hat, stick that over there, and let that render out. And oh man, this was a long, dense, just geek fest of a tutorial, people. Thank you. If you made it all the way through this, and you ever meet me in person, I'll buy you a beer, because God bless you. I mean, whoo, this must have been tough. But hopefully you learned something here. And if nothing else, you now have a little bit of an understanding of how freaking powerful expressions are, okay? I mean, you gotta understand that, like, you know, if you came up with some setup of particles and animations and things you're triggering with MIDI, and you love it and it looks awesome, and some band wants to hire you to do that for their entire concert set, all you have to do is update the MIDI, and this will all be done for you. It's amazing time saver for doing stuff like this. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. This was kind of an obvious, way of using the MIDI information. There's probably a lot of other really cool things you could do. I mean, you know, using, if you had a MIDI keyboard, and I mean, there's ways you could map this to actually literally be able to play an animation and then have After Effects create it for you. So anyway, I'm going to copy and paste these expressions onto the site so you guys can just grab them and paste them right on and use them, okay? And I'll put some links to some free MIDI resources in case you don't have the ability to actually use, to create your own MIDI files. But if you do, if you're a musician, or if you don't mind sort of getting your hands dirty and programming some stuff, oh my goodness, what a cool trick this is, and think of all the amazing things you could do with it. So thank you guys. I really appreciate all the troopers who made it through this entire tutorial. Promise the next one will not be like this, but every once in a while I got to go off the deep end. Thank you guys. I'll see you on the next episode of 30 Days of After Effects. You guys okay? I know that was a lot. And thank you. If you made it all the way through, I mean, go ahead and give yourself a pat on the back, because, wow, that was intense. So I hope you guys learned something. I mean, I'm sure you learned something. Whether or not it's useful is debatable. But what I really hope, at the very least, is that this shows you the power of After Effects expressions and what you can do if you understand a little bit and you're willing to tinker and kind of be like a mad scientist. You can pretty much make the program do whatever you want, which is awesome. It's one of the things I love about it. I want to say thanks one more time to the Department of Motion Design at the Ringling College of Art and Design for sponsoring 30 Days of After Effects, making all of this possible. And I want to thank you guys so much for watching these tutorials. And I just want to remind you, if you're not on the mailing list, if you're not on our Facebook page and you don't follow us on Twitter, those are ways that I can communicate directly with you and let you know what I'm doing. I can ask questions and I can sort of tailor things to make things more helpful, more useful to you guys. And I really appreciate the feedback too. Really, it's helpful, and it makes me feel good to know that something I did is actually helping you. So please definitely let me know if it is. Thank you guys so much. I'll see you next time.